Hi, everybody, and welcome to our December speaker series. Let's just give everybody a few minutes to sign on. Thank you so much for joining us today in December, a very busy season for many of us, so we really appreciate your time and being here. We're just going to give another minute or two to let everybody have a chance to log on to the webinar, and we're very excited about our conversation that we have planned today. If you're just joining, please bear with us just another minute or two before we get started. We're going to let people get onto the webinar, get settled, post lunchtime, very busy time of year. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to our December Speaker Series webinar. Our conversation today will be with Hayley Mason and Rebecca Aune from NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. NORD was the first national nonprofit to represent all rare diseases and is still the only foundation focusing on care, research, policy, and community for people with rare diseases. The foundation is proud to be members of NORD, and our founder, Estelle Benson, has a very special relationship with NORD as one of the earliest advisors to that organization. Today, I'm so excited to welcome NORD team members to talk about drug development and finding potential new treatment options for rare diseases. As always, we want to give a quick thank you to our sponsors, Annexon, CSL Behring, argenx, and Grifols. A final reminder that these webinars are meant to be educational and are not meant to troubleshoot or consult on individual cases. If you have questions about your care, as always, please talk to your doctor. If you do have a question about our topic today, please type it into the Q&A box below. You can find that towards the bottom of your screen, again, the Q&A box. But remember that we aren't troubleshooting individual circumstances or cases, and we're going to do our best to get to all of our questions, but no promises. So with that, I think we can get our conversation going. First of all, hello, Hayley. Hello, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
So let's actually get started with some introductions. Hayley, why don't you give a quick introduction to yourself, only because you're first on my screen. I'm not playing favorites.
Of course. So, hi, everybody. My name is Hayley Mason. I am a policy analyst with NORD, as Chelsea mentioned. I've been with NORD for 2.5 years. In my role, I focus on working with Congress and the FDA and NIH. So, my issues fall under those two government entities. And I'm just really excited to give a general overview and hopefully help educate y'all on the drug development process. Rebecca?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Aune. I'm Director of Education Programs at NORD. So I oversee NORD's portfolio of work to educate the rare disease community to drive advances in care and research and policy to improve the health and well-being of people living with rare diseases. And I've been with NORD for 4 years. And prior to coming to NORD, I did work for another NORD member organization, the Pulmonary Hypertension Association. So I, like Hayley, hold a master's in public administration. So we do just want to put a little disclaimer out here that neither of us are experts in drug development, in that we have not worked for drug sponsors or in the pharmaceutical space. We also have not worked directly as regulators in the regulatory space. So we are coming with a frame of reference as being patient advocates and educators on a daily basis for different stakeholder groups who are involved in the drug development process for rare diseases. So we do not have experience conducting clinical trials nor participating in them, but we do play a vital role in advocacy for more treatments for rare diseases, for better treatments for rare diseases, for effective and safe therapies for rare diseases. And recently I did play a vital role in putting together a new online course that is available to all of you for free at learn.rarediseases.org, which is all about the basics of drug development. So we'll touch on several key terms today, and this will be a really great conversation, I hope, about the importance of drug development and if improvements to the process and how patients and families and advocates can be a part of the process. But we certainly want to be, a conduit to continued learning for your specific disease population and to help bring more and effective therapies to your population and to your community.
Yeah, thank you so much. The GBS-CIDP Foundation International, our mission is centered around 4 pillars of support, education, research, and advocacy. And I always describe that special relationship between research and advocacy on how we bring the patient and community voice into the drug development process. And I really think that's what our conversation today is going to be about. So I think you guys are perfectly well suited for our conversation today.
Perfect.
So let's dive right in. I think the first thing we need to do is actually take a big picture approach and let's define drug development. Whoever wants to take that, let's start there.
Sure, I'll hop in. So drug development is the process of creating a medicine or a drug to cure illness or greatly reduce its effects on the body, or what we call symptoms. And it's a long and arduous and expensive process to begin with discovering a potential compound that could make an effect on that disease in the body, all the way through to FDA approval of that therapy. So this process starts with scientists studying how the disease works in the body, understanding how that disease starts and progresses in the body, and then potentially identifying ways that they could treat it. So they create and test different substances in a lab to see which ones might work as a medicine. And these substances go through several stages of testing to ensure that they are safe and effective. And first, that happens in like a scientist's lab. When you imagine a lab with preclinical research, and then it's tested on animals. And then later, after it gets through preclinical research, it can be studied in humans in clinical trials. So if a medicine proves successful in clinical trials, and all of the evidence is in place showing that it's safe and effective, and that the benefits of that drug outweigh the costs or negative effects on the body, it can then be approved by FDA and made available to patients. But the entire drug development process can take many years, and it requires collaboration between researchers, doctors, and companies. And I would like to share my screen for just a moment to show the 5 steps of drug development. So here are the 5 steps in drug development. And I think about this as sort of a funnel of sieves, where lots and lots of compounds could be, investigated to become potential treatments for rare diseases, but they have to shake through all of those sieves in the process to finally have a drug approval. So there could be 5,000 potential treatments that enter preclinical or lab testing to become a potential medicine for a disease, and maybe only one of those 5,000 may end up being approved. So that kind of gives a glimpse of why it's so hard to come by therapies that are FDA approved for rare diseases. And we'll talk about this today about, we all know rare diseases are often misunderstood or not understood. There are small populations of patients with each specific rare disease. Not a lot is known about those conditions. And it's hard to get them funding to fund the research to drive a new therapy forward. But you can see here that step 1 is really discovery and development. And that's really understanding that disease and trying to find compounds that may affect that disease in a positive way in the body. And preclinical research that we just talked about is really ensuring that they go through rigorous lab testing and animal testing before they can get to the clinical research step of actually being tested in humans. And then after all of the clinical trials take place and all of the data collected from the testing that participants undergo while testing this new potential treatment, the FDA review process is arduous. So new drug applications require a lot of evidence that this drug is effective and safe in humans. And then to get through that review process to approval isn't even the end, because there's what we call post-marketing safety monitoring and continued studies of the safety of those medicines. So basically, the best stats that we have are that about 14% of drugs entering clinical trials will ultimately be approved. And the cost of developing a new therapy typically ranges from $314 million to $2.8 billion. And that's because of all of the hoops we have to jump through to ensure that a treatment is safe and effective. And to find the money to see this through, that explains why it just really takes a long time. And it's really a very tedious process to bring a new therapy to market. And I do have a few other resources that we will make available. Chelsea promised we could share them out after this webinar, but we do have an infographic all about the Orphan Drug Act that we hope to be able to talk a little bit about today. We also have an infographic about the centers at the Food and Drug Administration that we work most frequently with in the rare disease space. And then we also have a one-pager all about the FDA drug review program so that you can differentiate between those different review programs that new drugs can go through in the FDA review and hopeful approval process. So we'll share those out after today's webinar.
Thank you so much. And Rebecca, I might be hanging those on my wall. First of all, it's a nice bright color, and my walls, as you can see, are a little white, so that might add some color. I wrote a couple things down that I just wanted to highlight or talk a little bit more about from your thorough response there. Thank you so much. The first was preclinical research, and we can't talk about preclinical research without me mentioning that I like to explain preclinical research as the stereotypical pipetting picture. Like if you go and look for stock photos of research, it's always people pipetting, and that really is the preclinical research. And Rebecca, at that point, are you thinking our scientists, they're working more with like almost kind of compounds and things like that?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily working with a drug that they know. They're working trying to put these biologics together to make the drug. Does that feel like a
Yes.
description?
So I would say, yes, they're definitely studying like a chemical or a compound, and they have to do a lot of research about all the compounds that we know exist and that have been studied to try to find one that might match that target in the body that they're trying to attempt to make positive change on with that disease.
Right.
So a lot of times, the target in the body is like a specific protein or a specific gene in the body. And once that target is identified of what they're trying to change to improve the symptoms of a disease, they look for these substances like chemicals or compounds that might interact with that protein or gene in a positive way. And if they can't find one in the lists and lists of them that exist, then they take on trying to create one.
Yeah.
But that's exactly right. They're
Yeah.
pipetting in
Yeah,
a lab.
and the pipetting, so much of it. And the
Yeah.
other half of that too is the identification of what to target in the body and in the disease. And especially thinking of GBS and CIDP, that's not always super clear. So they try to identify maybe different targets and try different things. And we're seeing that a little bit in the CIDP space where complement pathway is something that's getting talked about a lot now. So The other thing I wrote down was the risk-benefit ratio, because I think this is very important because there are drugs that have made it pretty far in the process, right? And then unfortunately, we see that the benefit does not outweigh the risk. And I just wanted to really flag that is something that does get really considered there, is that risk-benefit ratio. Did you want to elaborate any more on that as well?
No, but I agree with you. It's so important. I mean, you have to think about the toll on the body in general. And even if a new treatment seems very promising, you really have to think about the trade-offs and the risk to one's life and quality of life in treating those those symptoms of that
Yeah.
disease.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that too, I think there's so much benefit then in these researchers and regulators knowing the full picture of a patient's life then too, because then they get a better understanding of what that risk benefit ratio looks like. It's not necessarily just what's happening in the body, but the quality of life pieces, how extending life and things like that. So
Right.
okay, let's move on. What we talked a little bit about this, but maybe there's some more pieces to cover. What makes rare disease drug development different from developing drugs for non-rare diseases? So I'm assuming we still have to go through all of those steps, and we talked about, rare diseases are a little bit harder, but let's dig into why it's different.
Yeah, so I can take that, and you're exactly right, Chelsea. We still need those basic steps, but for rare diseases, it can complicate these basic steps a little bit, making researchers try to figure out alternative methods or alternative trial designs to adapt to the patient population. So, developing drugs for rare diseases is, like I said, more challenging than for common conditions because of the unique obstacles like these small patient populations. Some of these rare diseases have a broader patient population, but some only have hundreds, meaning that it's harder to find these folks throughout the United States, if not the world. There's also limited research into rare diseases. Are they genetic in nature? Like Rebecca said, how do these compounds impact the body that we are discovering? What is the natural history? And there's also quite a bit of funding issues. It is no joke that these drugs are very, very costly to develop and takes a lot of different entities and funding, different funders to create a drug. And so, to address all of these issues, Congress passed the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, which provides incentives for companies to focus on rare diseases. And like Rebecca said, she will have this handout on the Orphan Drug Act and sort of what it explains, but I'm sure we will also get more to the Orphan Drug Act a little bit later. Um, so unlike common conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure, we fully don't understand the genetic causes of the disease. There's a lack of research in the background of these diseases. There's not a lot of specialists in the United States or worldwide that are very focused in on these specific diseases. So like say you have a rare disease that focuses on like a heart condition. You might see a heart specialist that doesn't necessarily specialize in this rare disease, but does know the system very well. We also have a lack of understanding for the pathways in the body that leads to the system or the heterogeneity of the disease or how does it impact each person day to day, like you said. We also have a limited knowledge of certain biomarkers, which are measurable indicators of the disease that these scientists use to measure these outcomes and also how this drug is developing and working in the body. So, because of this lack of knowledge about rare diseases in general, researchers are essentially starting this from scratch every single time they are developing a drug. Um, and so when we're starting from scratch, we have funding issues, and these small patient populations are honestly probably the trickiest part. It's hard to find these participants for clinical trials because of the very, very small patient populations, and there's a burden cost on these families. We often see families traveling far distances to academic medical centers in these very urban, dense areas like New York, LA, or the Mayo Clinic. And a lot of these folks that are like rural based just simply do not have access to a lot of times to these institutions. Sometimes they're upending their life. We have research with NORD that families might spend upwards of $30,000 a year to participate in clinical trials. Some people might lose their jobs. It really does take a toll on the families. So not only do we have sort of the risk of the clinical trial itself, but you have this risk of what happens in your life by entering this clinical trial as well. So with NORD, in considering this as well, we believe that clinical trials should be flexible and we should leverage existing natural history studies, conduct research to get more natural history studies to be leveraged, and using alternative trial designs that are appropriate to address these small patient populations and the lack of data.
Yeah. This is making me think, I talked about the foundation really acknowledges that research and advocacy relationship. And I think this might be one of those examples in terms of you talked about the cost and all of that money. And the best place to find that much money is probably through the government, right? So the NIH budget, those are the kinds of budgets that can really help and fund this research. And that leads to the need for advocacy because we need to tell Congress to fund the NIH to continue to support this research. That's really where my mind was starting to go with all of that. Any other thoughts on that kind of bond of the research and advocacy there?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Being a strong advocate and sort of letting your voice be known to your representatives, whether it's your senators or your House person, or even in the state. Well, the states don't have a lot of leverage over the NIH, or if at all, but being a strong advocate and making your voice heard as to why this is important and funding the NIH and having proper funding for FDA so that regulators can do their jobs, have more staff to do it faster and maybe a little bit more quickly is really, really important. And also kind of having Congress to fund programs that would increase the development of drugs or pass more programs that would make these drug programs a little bit faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're always looking for advocacy volunteers. This is a plug to our audience. If anybody's interested in sharing their GBS-CIDP story, please, volunteer with us on Capitol Hill. And I also just want to give a shout out. We've been working very hard with the NIH to increase the GBS-CIDP and MMN research portfolio happening there. And we're super thrilled to share that a funding opportunity announcement went out for GBS and CIDP. So there's some specific research hopefully going to be funded by the NIH for our communities. We're very excited about that. That is a great segue actually to our next question about the beginning steps of developing a new drug.
Sure. So to develop a new drug, again, it really starts with understanding the biology of that disease that they're studying. So this is where natural history studies come into play. And I believe GBS-CIDP has a registry on the NORD IAMRARE platform.
We sure do.
Yes, and that includes the natural history of these diseases. And that's really important to show evidence that the disease has been studied and that a patient population has been followed over time. That can really provide good evidence along with the preclinical research and then clinical trial data in what we call a new drug application to the FDA, which we can talk about. But for instance, many patient advocacy organizations have a patient registry, which includes a natural history study. A natural history study is a medical research study that tracks a group of people living with a condition over time. And it really is to help researchers understand the disease and how it develops and progresses over time. And understanding the biology of a rare disease can be a little more difficult because, again, it's small groups of people. We maybe haven't found all of the people living with that condition, and there aren't patient advocacy organizations for every rare condition to find patients and families and to set up a registry. But also, again, not a lot is always understood about that disease and what it does in the body. But as more is learned about a rare disease, scientists again look for those targets in the body, which again could be a gene or a protein. And once they identify the target that they want to work on with a drug, Then they look for substances like chemicals or compounds that could have a positive impact on that target in the body. And if they can't find one that already exists, like I said, then they work to create one in the lab. And once scientists find or create a promising compound to treat that target in the body, they call that a lead candidate. So then scientists can kind of work on and tweak that lead candidate compound to make it work better and last longer in the body. They also can work on it to see if they can cause fewer side effects on the body of that drug. So then before any drug made from that compound is given to people, it undergoes rigorous testing in the preclinical research phase, which involves experiments in the lab and on animals to check the safety of the compound as well as its effectiveness. And then the clinical trials will test step-by-step tests in humans, starting with a small population and eventually including many participants, as many participants as they can enroll in a study who meet that study's criteria to ensure that the drug is safe and works well. So again and again and again and again in the drug development process, you're going to hear the words safe and effective. That's what's important to the FDA, is that a drug is safe and effective. But sometimes a drug made for another condition could help with another. For example, a medicine designed for heart disease might also relieve symptoms of a rare condition. I used to work in the pulmonary hypertension space. We all know why Viagra is often prescribed, but they found out that it also had the side effects that were helping people with pulmonary arterial hypertension. So they actually then got approval to use that drug in children living with pulmonary arterial hypertension to help them breathe better and to prevent left heart failure. This is called drug repurposing. And because the drug's safety is already really understood because it's been studied preclinically and then in clinical trials for the condition that it's already been approved for, this can save a lot of time in the drug development process because then it can be studied in this other rare condition, but a lot of safety data is already established. So drug repurposing is something that is often looked at in rare disease. Granted, many rare diseases are genetic in nature, so drug repurposing is going to be much more difficult for many conditions, but it does seem like a no-brainer that we should be trying to use drugs that have already been created and approved for all of the diseases where they can make a positive impact. And in many cases in the rare disease community, drugs that are already approved for other conditions are prescribed off-label for people who have a condition that the drug is helping, but for which it has not been FDA approved.
Yeah. I think so much of this is coming down to how much pipetting we need to do for each of this, right? So when we're starting with a brand new compound, that is the tweaking you were talking about, and that's kind of really that discovery phase. The repurposing phase, the pipetting has already been done theoretically. So we're just looking in a clinical trial, of course, even still with repurposing, we're just looking at the side effect profile in this specific disease population and the effectiveness, like you were saying, that safety and effectiveness are such good keywords. So less pipetting for the repurposing, but still a lengthy process.
Right.
And the pipetting was done in the past. I hope that's helpful. That's how I'm thinking of it. So
Yes.
all of this is highlighting how important basic research is, but there's no avoiding that it's expensive. So let's talk about, how does basic research get funded and what can we do to support it?
Yeah, so basic research is obviously critical for rare disease drug development. But yeah, you're right. It's incredibly expensive. But this funding for early stage research often comes from five sources or several sources, but there's five big sources that we talk about, which includes like government grants from the NIH and FDA, like we had previously mentioned. Oftentimes, they will provide money and grants to scientists or researchers that are working on promising ideas. Investors and venture capitalists, these are often biotechnology companies that rely on investors to back their research. So then again, they would say in the same way of a government grant, they would have to have a promising sort of early research into a drug in order to gain this type of capital. Corporate donations. These big companies sometimes donate money to support scientific advancements that show promise as well. Universities, a lot of these academic medical institutions. So, for example, like the Mayo Clinic, Duke University, Baylor, all these big folks that have these large medical programs fund their own research to explore new ideas and might receive grants as well. And then also, there's the patient advocacy organizations that fund their own research or have their own research departments like NORD and GBS to find new treatments or to conduct natural history studies through their own ways. But yeah, basic research needs support from everybody, not just these big five that I've mentioned. And there's a few ways that folks can work to make a difference. People can donate or fundraise if they have the means to do so. You can donate to patient advocacy organizations and rare disease researches for drug development. This would support patient advocacy groups in finding treatments and developing these natural histories, especially for conditions that don't have cures yet. And then, like we previously mentioned, getting involved in advocacy and urging your elected officials, whether that be your member that's in the House of Representatives or your senator or your state and local officials, to prioritize legislation that incentivizes rare disease research, drug development, to support scientific funding and advocate for increased support for agencies like the NIH and the FDA, and even the CDC for that matter.
Yeah, super helpful for that five list. I just wanted to run through it quickly again. So the government grants such as the NIH, I'll
Mhm.
also throw in the peer-reviewed medical research program at the Department of Defense. That's another good one.
Yes.
Investors and venture capitalists,
Mhm.
corporate donations,
Yes.
universities, and foundations.
Correct. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So we are just about halfway through, so I wanted to give a quick reminder that if you do have a question, to use the Q&A box at the bottom. And this feels like a good time to move away a little bit away from the pipetting and move and talk a little bit more about clinical trials. So we've alluded to this a few times. Clinical trials are an essential process for potential new therapies. Who initiates clinical trials and then who oversees them?
Sure, I'll take this one. So when a drug shows promise in the preclinical research or lab and animal studies, the company developing that drug takes the next step by initiating clinical trials to study that drug in humans. And clinical trials are very much a team effort that involve the drug developers who are studying that drug, medical professionals, and the Food and Drug Administration or FDA. They all work together to ensure that potential new treatments are safe and effective for the people who need them. So that begins with the trial sponsor, which is usually the company that created the drug. We call them the drug sponsor, puts together clinical trial teams to enroll patients or enroll participants in that study. Depending on the clinical trial, it's not always patients. Sometimes you need healthy volunteers as well as participants. They set up the detailed plans for how that trial will be conducted, what type of data they need from what kinds of tests they need those participants to go through. And they also ensure that the process is consistent and fair. And then the clinical investigators, who are medical professionals, doctors, and researchers who oversee the day-to-day work of running the trial, they ensure that the drug is tested properly and ethically. And then the FDA plays a big role in oversight to make sure that clinical trials are safe and meet their strict standards. So even before a trial starts, the FDA reviews the trial plan to ensure that it complies with the regulations that are designed to protect participants. And once the trial begins, the FDA monitors that trial through reports and inspections to make sure everything is staying on track. And then even within the sponsoring company, the drug sponsor, they often have regulatory experts on staff who ensure that that trial follows FDA guidelines and any other legal requirements. So it's very much a team effort between many different types of professionals um, to really from planning a clinical trial through executing that clinical trial and pulling that data together for the new drug application to the FDA.
Yeah. This is maybe a silly follow-up question, but when we think about the FDA, what is a typical kind of profile of somebody who works there? For example, are they scientists? Are they doctors, statisticians, a little bit of everything? Any thoughts on that?
It is a little bit of everything. So many of them do come from physician researcher background. There are many statisticians on staff at the FDA. Many come from a research background. Hayley, what else? There are lots of professions.
There's quite a few lawyers as well in this process to make sure that everything goes the way it should in clinical trials. But I think the crux of the organization are these MD, PhD folks. That's a lot of the heads of the different organizations. They, work as doctors and then also do the research in their spare time. Most of the folks that I have worked with in talking to the FDA, though, have their medical degree.
Makes sense. Yeah. I think sometimes it's important to remember that it's scientists overseeing other scientists in a lot of these situations too. And hopefully there's a lot of respect for the science there because that's the most important thing here when we're looking at the safety and the effectiveness of something is really what does the data say? So,
Definitely.
yeah. All right. So moving along with clinical trials, patient participation in clinical trials. We have a few questions about this. But let's start. Can you give a quick overview of a patient's role in a clinical trial? What does it mean for somebody to be in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so patients in clinical trials are partners throughout this research project. They play a crucial role in advancing this medicine while receiving care and oversight from medical doctors along the way and these researchers. Once again, there's five main parts of what is involved in a clinical trial participation. The first and foremost, and probably the biggest thing, is giving consent. Before participating, patients must sign an informed consent form and demonstrate that they fully understand the ramifications in which they are participating in this trial. So this form will document and explain what the trial is about, what to expect. Is there placebo control? Is it randomized? Is it blinded? And any potential risks or benefits that they might know about yet. And like I said, this is to ensure, double check, triple check that patients fully understand the process before joining the trial. And then the trial, would go into randomization, which also involves the patient participation in many trials. And this goes through for regular diseases as much as rare diseases. So many trials participants are randomly assigned to typically one of three groups: a group that is receiving the standard care, so like their usual treatment for the condition. So say they have cystic fibrosis, they're still getting this care for their lungs and getting the care for the mucus in their lungs and sort of really receiving that sort of treatment. There's also a placebo, which, as many of y'all know, is a substance without the active drug, like a sugar pill, has no therapeutic effect. Oftentimes, though, because of the small patient population, there's some trouble with conducting a randomized control trial with a placebo. This often leads researchers to choose alternative trial designs in concurrence with the FDA and their approval and oversight to do alternative trial designs. And then you might have folks in the experimental treatment group, where the new drug is actively being tested. And like I said, some folks might know that they're in the experimental group. People might not know what group they're in, and sort of to keep this trial as blinded as possible. Um, and then it would go into close monitoring. Once enrolled, participants are closely monitored by these researchers and doctors throughout the trial. They check for side effects, the effectiveness, track how well it works, and they ensure, first and foremost, the safety for the patient. And then number four, just to clarify that even though they've signed this informed consent form, patients always have the right to withdraw at any time during a clinical trial. They have the freedom to leave for any reason, and participation in this is always voluntary. And then number five is their rescue protocol. If the experimental treatment causes harm or doesn't work well, participants are switched to an alternative treatment to protect their health. So that's kind of the five big ways in the process of the clinical trial that patients are involved in.
Super helpful. Thank you so much. I have a couple of follow-ups. I
Yeah.
hope you don't mind. So, number one is for a patient to enroll in a clinical trial, they need to be under the care of a doctor who's taking part in the clinical trial. So I think I just wanted to clarify, like, if your doctor is not participating in the clinical trial, still talk to them, right? Because they might work with somebody who is in the clinical trial and they can get you, and you don't always necessarily have to leave your own doctor.
Yes.
So always being mindful of the location. And you talked at great length earlier about the access, and especially if we're in rural areas and a site is so far away. The other thing to ask about is travel, right? If a clinical trial can help cover some of those travel and expense costs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that was more of a statement than a question. Now I have two other questions. Can we talk a little bit about patient diversity in clinical trials? I think there has been maybe a little bit of a history and stigma of only a certain type of person participating in clinical trials. So what are we doing to change that?
Yeah, so the FDA has really paid attention to this issue and really needing to broaden, not only for racial background or ethnic background or gender diversity, but also, like financial diversity or other issues like that. So they are also broadening this eligibility criteria. So having patients in clinical trials that might have other comorbidities and including them in this sort of trial to bring in more folks that have this disease to broaden the clinical trial participants. The FDA has also released two draft guidances to demonstrate their current thinking on how to increase diversity in clinical trials. And these two are their decentralized clinical trials draft guidance. This draft guidance encouraged sponsors and drug manufacturers to conduct trials in a decentralized manner. So that means under the purview of your doctor that is working with these researchers. So, for example, this might just be with just your doctor and they are collecting the data rather than going to these big academic institutions. You can do it where you're comfortable at your home and being monitored. Um, and this will hopefully gain a more diverse study population for folks that maybe have mobility issues and want to be able to participate anyways, folks that don't want to leave their jobs, folks that didn't have the mechanisms to travel or any other issue like that. So yeah, their goal is to really sort of meet patients where they are and mitigating these costs of the clinical trials. So they think by doing efforts like that, that can increase it. And then one that sort of addressed it more directly is their draft guidance that they had on a diversity action plan to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented populations in clinical trials. This explicitly asked manufacturers for a diversity action plan intended to increase study enrollment of participants from historically underrepresented populations. This would help improve the data the agency or the FDA receives about patients who may potentially use medical products or treatments. So, sort of when they're in the process of working with the FDA, establishing trial designs and stuff like that, what is also your plan to have folks from underrepresented backgrounds in this trial as well, and working with the FDA to navigate and identify?
Very, very interesting and important work. And especially as we know more just about how different bodies react to different things, we want to make sure that clinical trials represent the actual patient population. So sometimes that's a little more effort that needs to be put into it. And I wrote down decentralized because I think that makes so much sense for the GBS-CIDP MMN population, many of whom get their regular treatments at home. So maybe there's a way for home clinical trial participation in the future, and that's what we would like to see.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm giving us just about our 15-minute warning. Have a couple more questions. The one that I did want to get to is technology, such as AI and this big data. How is that changing clinical trials or the drug development process?
I'll take a stab. So, artificial intelligence or AI, we're finding can help with the faster discovery of new medicines. So, AI can be sort of a super powered search engine, and scientists can use that to sort through millions of chemical compounds to find ones that might work for the target that they're looking to make an impact on. So obviously that can speed up the process. Researchers don't have to go to multiple libraries and do their own searching if they can use AI technology to do it much faster and not have to rely so much on guesswork. Scientists can also use AI to run computer simulations to see how a drug might behave in the body before they even test it in the lab, which is pretty cool. Um, Also, AI can assist with drug repurposing, which I touched on earlier about finding new uses for sort of old drugs to save time and efforts. Um, AI can also help make clinical trials more efficient because AI can scan medical records really quickly to find patients who meet the criteria to be enrolled in a trial. Um, AI can also analyze the results of a trial as they come in. So scientists could tweak the trial as they go rather than waiting until it's finished to find out what maybe wasn't the strongest um, way to gather the evidence that they really need. Um, and AI can help them like spot failures early so that they don't waste time of participants or themselves and money on drugs that aren't going to work. Also, wearable devices like fitness trackers and apps can collect real-time health data from patients, making it easier for patients to keep track of their health during a trial, which is kind of interesting. Um, and also, AI can not only comb through patient records, but also insurance claims to see how well a drug is working in everyday life, which can fine-tune treatments to ensure that they meet patients' needs. And we do have a couple of examples of like real life wins of using AI for drug development. Um, AlphaFold is a tool that was created by DeepMind that predicts how proteins fold, which was a crucial step in understanding diseases um, that affect proteins in the body. And then Exsentia is an AI company that has discovered new drug candidates, like chemical compound candidates, faster than our traditional methods of discovery, and have even gotten some into clinical trials faster by using those AI tools. So I really think there's a lot of potential for the future of making preclinical and clinical research more efficient for rare diseases.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those examples. That's really helpful and inspiring. And even though this is new, I think the potential is huge. But I will say I will be very sad if our pipetting goes away. If we lose all of those images of pipetting and basic research is now just a computer,
I
I
don't
don't know what we're
suspect
going to
it's
refer to.
I don't suspect it's going anywhere, especially when they have to create that new compound, right? So
That's fair. That's fair. Okay, I feel better now. All right. So for the last few minutes, so we really touched upon pipetting and basic research and repurposing. We talked about clinical trials and moving through that process and the FDA oversight. So when a clinical trial is completed, then what happens?
So once the clinical trial is completed, the researchers really have to analyze all of that data that's been collected from those clinical trial sites and all of the participants who participated over time, to examine that evidence and determine if that treatment is safe and effective, and whether the benefits outweigh the risks on their daily lives. But that's just the beginning of the next step, which is getting that treatment reviewed by the FDA and hopefully approved. So after all the data is analyzed, the drug sponsor company will put all that data into a package that I call a new drug application, or FDA calls it the NDA. Or if it's like a gene or cell therapy, it's called a biologics license application, or BLA. So that application for a new drug includes those results from the clinical trial, information about how the drug is going to be manufactured, details about how that drug is intended to be used, and also safety information to show that the treatment is not causing harmful side effects. And then the FDA goes through that whole application package with a fine-tooth comb. So those scientists and doctors and statisticians at FDA examine all of the evidence in that application to, again, make sure that it's a safe and effective treatment. And if they need to, they'll go back to the drug sponsor for more information or even request additional studies if something is not clear or they don't feel there's enough evidence to prove safety or effectiveness. Um, and then the FDA can either approve the treatment for use, again, request more data and keep it open, or decline approval if the drug does not meet their rigorous standards for safety or effectiveness. I think it's really important for patient advocacy groups like yours to understand that you all can be a part of educating the FDA so that they can understand the unique challenges of the conditions that you are living with, about the symptoms, the lack of current treatments, what success looks like, what success would mean in a therapy, like what burdens would be lifted off of your family, what symptoms are the most important to tackle, like what are the day-to-day burdens on you living with your disease. And early engagement with the FDA and the drug sponsor is really important, because the FDA wants to help design better trials, and they can even suggest endpoints, which are goals for measuring that drug's effectiveness in a study. And also, it just builds trust. If patient advocates and drug sponsors and FDA all have a good working relationship, that really helps in the drug development process.
That's a great description, and I'll give a quick plug onto how we engage in that process. So, if anybody who is listening is interested, we are always looking for volunteers. We work with industry sponsors who are looking to do clinical trials, to do patient panels, so that the sponsors can hear directly from patients. We have held two meetings kind of under this program at the FDA to bring the patient voice in front of the FDA so that the FDA has awareness of the conditions of the community. Those are externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. We've also done patient listening sessions with the FDA. So all of this we pull from our great volunteer community. So please consider volunteering with us and stay tuned to the foundation. So we have a couple minutes left, and I have three. They can kind of be rapid fire questions. So let's go. What role does the government and Congress play in drug development in the US?
Yeah, so they play a big part in drug development. They play a major role in shaping it in the U.S., especially for our rare diseases through regulation, funding, and different policies to encourage innovation. So, like Rebecca said, FDA regulates to ensure that all the drugs available are safe and effective. The NIH can provide significant funding to scientists, especially in early stage discovery. But I think the crux of your question would be, what does Congress do and how can they sort of be involved and help the cause for rare diseases? So they can create and pass legislation that encourages drug development through laws and initiatives. So, for example, the Orphan Drug Act, which we'll share sort of that infographic on, the 1983 law gives companies financial incentives to develop treatments for rare diseases like tax credits. I think it's a 25% cut tax credit. Fee waivers, not having to pay the user fees to FDA, which are often very costly, and a 7-year market exclusivity period, meaning nobody else can enter the market with that same drug for the same disease. One that is quite a hot topic right now is the Priority Review Voucher Program, which is a very wonky but very important piece of legislation which helps incentivize companies to develop treatments for rare pediatric diseases that are rare and serious conditions. A company in this program that develops a drug that targets rare pediatric diseases would receive a voucher. This is a tangible voucher that the FDA would give them upon approval. This company would have two choices. They could either keep the voucher themselves and for a second drug that this company develops, be able to put that drug under priority review, which means that they speed up the timeline for 4 months, or by 4 months, from 10 months to 6 months. And you might be like, well, this is only 4 months. 4 months in drug development timeline for not only the timeline, but also just for capital and sort of what they would reap back in there to bring back to drug development. It is astronomical what the difference 4 months can make. So they can use it for themselves, or the more common alternative is that this company sells this voucher to a larger company that can then use that voucher on a drug that they developed. This is often the more lucrative way they do it because these vouchers are not cheap. I think one of the cheapest ones I've ever seen go is $100 million, with the most expensive one being $320 million being sold. So they're quite valuable. And then not only through Congress, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, they enable companies to secure patents for their innovations. So a lot of times companies can get patents for their drug for 20 years and protect their investments and encourage companies to spend billions on developing drugs on newdrugs.org, or they can sell the voucher for millions of dollars as well. So that's sort of like a quick what can Congress do and sort of the current landscape going into 2025 for rare disease drug development.
Much appreciate that. And always, we need more patient voices on Capitol Hill talking to Congress. Always. And a thank you to NORD, who often leads a lot of these issues and distills it for organizations like us to help support NORD's efforts, because it's bigger than one rare disease. You know, it benefits all of us. So a thank you to NORD for your policy work on all of those issues. Quick last two questions. I'm trying to get us done on time. What is a realistic timeline for a new drug to be available to treat a disease? That's a loaded question to answer quickly.
Yeah, so for standard treatments, that timeline is still about 10 to 15 years due to the rigorous testing and regulatory requirements. For rare diseases that are going through the gold standard randomized controlled trial, this can be a little bit longer just because of the randomized controls trial. But oftentimes in the rare disease world or for urgent conditions, drugs for rare diseases can reach to market in 5 to 10 years using programs like accelerated approval, breakthrough designation, fast track. And there's another one that I know that's on our infographic that I'm forgetting right now, but there's other programs and designations that help bring products faster to market faster. So just for example, the way that they do that is the accelerated approval one. Accelerated approval was created during the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1980s to get to therapies to folks living with the virus faster. They used a surrogate endpoint, which measured that the surrogate endpoint after a therapy was created got this viral load down lower than what it was before they were taking. Seeing that this is a crisis and an urgent need, they put it on the market with the promise that they are going to continue studying and have sort of this confirmatory trial at the end to make sure that this drug is safe and effective as it is working like the surrogate endpoint dictated. So this surrogate endpoint would mark an advancement, like I said, meaning continued research and testing will still be needed to see the full therapy scope and impact. So, but these programs, it can be 5 to 10 years, or realistically, kind of what we're looking at without these programs is 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years.
Yeah. Good to know. Again, I think a big takeaway is that we're dealing in years in all of this, and that a lot of the policies that we have advocated for expedited rare disease drug development tend to work. So again, thank you. Last question, right at the buzzer. For patients who are eager for new innovative therapies to treat their rare disease, what advice can we give the community?
Again, I'd love for you to register for our free online course on learn.rarediseases.org called the Rare Disease Drug Development Series, What Patients and Advocates Need to Know. We'll make sure to share information with you after this webinar. Definitely be contributing to your patient organization's registry. Share your thoughts in public comment areas, continue doing those patient-focused drug development and listening sessions, and making sure your voice is heard. Talk to your healthcare provider about new therapies or experimental treatments, and keep exploring clinical trials and see if you fit the eligibility criteria to participate. We need participants. And don't underestimate the power of your story, whether you're speaking at conferences, sharing your journey on social media, sharing it with FDA. Those really matter and help shape the future of drug development.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end. Hayley, Rebecca, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time, your expertise, your knowledge, and all of the great work that you are doing at NORD. I just want to give one last quick shout out to our sponsors who help make our virtual education programs like this happen. If you do have a question, the email address is now on the screen, advocacy@gbs-cidp.org. We will be following up with some of the resources that we've talked about today. And thank you to everybody who stuck with us for this fantastic conversation. We will see you next time. And Rebecca and Hayley, one last final heartfelt thank you for this excellent discussion.
Our pleasure. Take good care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.